The moment Drill Sergeant Hayes grabbed Private Rachel Torres by the collar in front of 284 witnesses, time itself seemed to fracture. What happened in the next 30 seconds would shatter every assumption, rewrite every judgment, and leave an entire battalion questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, respect, and the woman who had been invisible among them for months. The morning had started like every other at Fort Cumberland. Steam rose from the asphalt as the first light cut through the Virginia mountains, and the sound of boots echoed across the parade ground in rhythmic precision. Companies A through D had assembled for the quarterly battalion review. 284 soldiers standing in perfect formation, their uniforms pressed, their boots gleaming, their faces set in the practiced mask of military bearing. Private Rachel Torres stood in the third row of Bravo Company, her position unremarkable, her presence barely registering among the sea of identical green uniforms. At first glance, she was everything the Army tried to create: regulation height, regulation posture, regulation silence. But look closer, really look, and the cracks appeared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her boots were wrong. Not dirty, not unkempt, but wrong in a way that spoke of too many miles, too many missions, too much weight carried over ground that wasn't supposed to leave marks. The leather had been conditioned countless times, polished until it held a deep, weathered shine that new boots could never achieve. The soles showed the kind of wear that came from walking point, from carrying wounded, from standing watch in places where sitting meant dying. Her uniform fit differently too. Not loose, not tight, but shaped by a body that had learned efficiency in movement. Her sleeves showed the faintest outline where patches had been removed and replaced, sewn with the kind of precision that suggested muscle memory rather than vanity. The fabric around her collar had been pressed so many times it held creases that wouldn't exist on a uniform worn only for garrison duty. But it was her stillness that marked her as different. While other soldiers shifted weight, adjusted straps, or stole glances at their neighbors, Rachel stood like she was carved from stone. Not rigid, that would suggest effort. Still in the way that comes from having learned that movement could mean death, that discipline was measured not in how straight you stood but in how long you could hold that straightness when everything around you was falling apart. The other soldiers had noticed her, of course. In the barracks, in the chow hall, during the endless hours of training that filled their days. But they noticed her the way you notice wallpaper, present, functional, unremarkable. She didn't laugh at the right jokes. She didn't complain about the right things. She didn't join the conversations about home, about plans after discharge, about the weekend pass everyone was hoping for. Private Jessica Kane, standing 2 positions to Rachel's left, had nicknamed her Ghost during their 3rd week of training. Not because Rachel was pale or thin, but because she moved through their world without seeming to touch it. She completed every task assigned, met every standard demanded, and then disappeared back into whatever quiet space she occupied when no one was looking. Specialist Tommy Rodriguez, squad leader and self-appointed voice of Bravo Company's 3rd Squad, had tried to crack Rachel's silence during their first month. He'd made jokes, asked questions, even tried the direct approach of asking what her story was. Rachel had answered when necessary, yes sir, no sir, understood, but never volunteered anything beyond what was required. Rodriguez had eventually given up, marking her down as one of those soldiers who showed up, did the work, and counted days until they could return to civilian life. They were wrong about the counting days part, though none of them knew it yet. The review had been proceeding according to script. Colonel Martinez walked the line with his usual measured pace, stopping occasionally to inspect a weapon or correct a minor infraction. Behind him, the company commanders followed like shadows, their eyes scanning for problems that might embarrass them in front of the battalion commander. Captain Williams led Bravo Company's officer contingent, his face carrying the particular tension of a man who knew his soldiers were good but worried they might not look good under scrutiny. First Sergeant Patterson walked beside him, her experienced eye-catching details the officers missed, her presence a stabilizing force that kept the company tight. And behind them all, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had built a career on finding flaws, came Drill Sergeant Hayes. Hayes had been at Fort Cumberland for 6 years, long enough to develop a reputation that preceded him into every training cycle. He was the kind of non-commissioned officer who could smell weakness from across a parade ground, who could identify the soldiers who would break under pressure before they knew it themselves. His voice could strip paint, his presence could make grown men question their life choices, and his standards were legendary even among drill instructors who prided themselves on being impossible to please. He stopped in front of Rachel Torres without warning. The battalion held its collective breath. Hayes didn't stop randomly. When he stopped, it meant he had found something worth his attention, and nothing good ever came from earning Drill Sergeant Hayes's attention during a formal review. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She maintained her bearing as Hayes circled her slowly, his eyes taking inventory of everything. Her posture, her equipment, her uniform, her expression. The inspection felt predatory, like a hawk examining a mouse, and the soldiers nearby began to lean imperceptibly away as if Hayes's attention might prove contagious. He completed his circle and stepped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area when he spoke. "Private Torres," he said, his tone carrying the kind of quiet menace that was somehow worse than shouting. "Yes, Drill Sergeant. You think you're special?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Around them, 283 other soldiers tried to disappear into their own uniforms while maintaining the illusion of not listening. This was the moment when careers could end, when one wrong word could turn a routine inspection into a public execution. "No, Drill Sergeant." Hayes studied her face, looking for the crack, the tell, the moment when her composure would slip and reveal whatever weakness he sensed beneath the surface. Rachel stared straight ahead, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. That was when Hayes grabbed her collar. Private Rachel Torres had arrived at Fort Cumberland on a Tuesday in March, carrying a single duffel bag and a transfer order that raised no eyebrows. Her paperwork was clean, unremarkable, another soldier rotating through the system, another body to fill a slot in the training rotation. Administrative Specialist Davis had processed her in-processing documents with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to everyone else, checking boxes, filing forms, assigning her a bunk number and a locker combination. "Previous duty station?" he had asked without looking up from his computer screen. "Fort Benning, Georgia," Rachel replied, her voice steady and professional. Davis typed the information, printed her ID card, and handed her a folder containing the standard welcome packet. Maps of the base, dining facility hours, uniform regulations, and a schedule for newcomer orientation. Standard issue bureaucracy for a standard issue soldier. What Davis didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rachel's last assignment at Fort Benning had ended with a medical retirement recommendation that she had successfully appealed. 3 separate review boards had examined her case. 3 separate panels of doctors and officers had signed off on her return to active duty, and 3 separate files had been sealed and marked for limited distribution only. Her personnel records told the sanitized story the Army preferred. Private Rachel Torres, 24 years old, military occupational specialty 11B infantry. Clean disciplinary record. Satisfactory performance evaluations. No flags, no issues, no problems that couldn't be solved with proper leadership and clear expectations. The records didn't mention the 2 Bronze Stars. They didn't mention the 18 months of physical therapy. They didn't mention the nightmares that had cost her 30 pounds and 6 months of sleep, or the 3 different psychiatrists who had cleared her for duty only after she learned to give them the answers they wanted to hear. Most importantly, the records didn't mention Afghanistan. Rachel's first week at Fort Cumberland had been deliberately unremarkable. She found her place in the formation, learned the local routines, and identified the informal power structure that existed beneath the official chain of command. Every unit had its own personality, its own rhythm, and she had learned long ago that survival meant adapting quickly and quietly to whatever environment she found herself in. Bravo Company was typical of garrison units, soldiers marking time between deployments, going through the motions of peacetime Army life while waiting for something real to happen. They trained hard enough to pass inspections, maintained their equipment well enough to avoid counseling statements, and counted the days until their next leave period. The company commander, Captain Williams, Was a decent officer struggling with the reality that leading soldiers in peacetime was harder than leading them in combat. In combat, every decision mattered, every order had immediate consequences, and every soldier understood that their life might depend on following instructions without question. In garrison, orders felt arbitrary, consequences seemed distant, and soldiers had time to think about whether they respected the person giving them directions. First Sergeant Patterson understood this dynamic better than most. She had been in the Army for 19 years, long enough to see multiple wars, multiple generations of soldiers, and multiple approaches to leadership. She knew that garrison duty was where soldiers either developed real discipline or learned to fake it well enough to get by. Her job was to ensure Bravo Company fell into the first category. Rachel watched and learned during those first weeks, studying the personalities and patterns that would define her experience. She identified the natural leaders, the troublemakers, the soldiers who could be counted on, and the ones who would disappear when things got difficult. She learned which sergeants understood their jobs and which ones were still figuring it out, which officers had earned their authority and which ones were borrowing it from their rank. What she didn't realize was that others were studying her as well. Private Jessica Kane had been at Fort Cumberland for 8 months when Rachel arrived, long enough to feel like a veteran among the newer soldiers but not long enough to have real authority. She worked in the company orderly room, filing reports and answering phones, a position that gave her access to information and opinions that most soldiers never heard. Jessica had noticed Rachel immediately, not because Rachel stood out, but because she didn't. Most new soldiers arrived with either nervous energy or cocky confidence. They talked too much or too little, tried too hard to fit in, or made a point of standing apart. Rachel did none of these things. She simply appeared, found her place, and became part of the landscape without creating any waves. "There's something off about the new girl," Jessica mentioned to Specialist Rodriguez during a slow afternoon in the orderly room. Rodriguez looked up from the equipment inventory he was pretending to work on. "Torres? What do you mean off?" "I don't know. She's too." Jessica paused, searching for the right word. "Comfortable. Like she's done this before." "She has done this before. She came from Benning, right?" "No, I mean really done this. Look at how she moves during PT. Look at how she handles her weapon during drill. Look at how she stands when nobody's watching." Jessica leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I pulled her records yesterday when Patterson asked for the newcomer files. Clean as a whistle. Too clean." Rodriguez considered this. He had noticed Rachel during their first group PT session, had seen how she paced herself through the run, how she moved through the obstacle course, how she handled the physical training that left some soldiers gasping and others pretending they weren't struggling. Rachel had completed everything competently but not impressively, meeting standards without exceeding them, performing well enough to avoid attention. But there had been moments. A split second during the rope climb when her form had been perfect, not good or adequate but perfect in a way that suggested muscle memory. A brief instant during the combat skills lane when she had moved through cover like someone who understood that cover wasn't just an abstract concept but the difference between coming home and not coming home. "Maybe she's just squared away," Rodriguez suggested, but his tone carried doubt. "Squared away soldiers don't hide how squared away they are," Jessica replied. "Especially not the young ones. They want everyone to know how good they are." She was right, and Rodriguez knew it. Soldiers with real competence usually found ways to display it, especially when they were trying to establish themselves in a new unit. Rachel showed no interest in demonstrating her capabilities, no desire to stand out, no apparent ambition beyond completing assigned tasks and maintaining acceptable standards. It was Sergeant First Class Morrison who first articulated what others were beginning to sense. Morrison had been Rachel's squad leader for 3 weeks when he mentioned her to First Sergeant Patterson during their weekly leader meeting. "Patterson, what do you know about Torres? New arrival from Benning. Clean record, no issues." "Why?" Morrison shifted in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Something doesn't add up. She knows things." "What kind of things?" "Equipment things. Tactical things. Yesterday I was showing the squad how to properly clean the M249, and she was following along like she was learning it for the first time. But her hands." Morrison paused. "Her hands moved like she could have done it blindfolded. And when I demonstrated immediate action drills, she was already moving before I finished explaining what we were going to do. Patterson made a note in her leader book. She had learned to pay attention when experienced non-commissioned officers identified soldiers who didn't fit the expected pattern. Sometimes those soldiers were problems waiting to happen. Sometimes they were assets the Army hadn't learned to properly utilize. "Keep an eye on her," Patterson said. "Let me know if you see anything else." What Morrison saw over the following weeks was a soldier who performed every task with quiet competence while maintaining the fiction that everything was new to her. Rachel attended every class, participated in every drill, and asked appropriate questions, but her questions were too precise, her performance too consistent, her adaptation too quick for someone supposedly learning these skills for the first time. The other soldiers began to notice as well, though they interpreted what they saw through the lens of their own experience and expectations. To them, Rachel was the quiet one, the one who didn't talk about herself, the one who seemed content to blend into the background. They assumed she was shy, or maybe just boring. They assumed she had never done anything worth talking about. They were wrong, but Rachel did nothing to correct their assumptions. She had learned, through experience more painful than any of them could imagine, that sometimes the safest place to hide was in plain sight, and sometimes the best way to survive was to let people see only what they expected to see. So she became what they needed her to be. Another face in formation, another soldier marking time, another unremarkable presence in their unremarkable garrison routine. But competence has a way of revealing itself, even when someone tries to hide it. And sooner or later, someone always notices when the quiet one moves like they've been to war. The first cracks in Rachel's carefully constructed invisibility appeared during the 4th week of her assignment, though they were so subtle that most soldiers missed them entirely. It started with small things, gestures, reactions, moments of competence that lasted a fraction of a second before disappearing back into her practiced mediocrity. Private Kane was the first to notice because her job in the orderly room had trained her to observe details that others overlooked. During a routine equipment inspection, she watched Rachel handle her M4 rifle with movements that were too fluid, too automatic. While other soldiers fumbled with chamber checks and function tests, Rachel's hands moved with mechanical precision, each action flowing seamlessly into the next without conscious thought. "Did you see that?" Kane whispered to Private Martinez, who was standing beside her during the inspection. "See what?" "Torres, watch how she handles her weapon." Martinez looked over just as Rachel completed her inspection and returned to the position of attention. Nothing unusual. Nothing that stood out. "What about it?" "Never mind," Kane said, but she filed the observation away with the growing collection of small inconsistencies that surrounded Rachel Torres. The pattern continued during physical training. While other soldiers struggled through the obstacle course, Rachel moved with economy of motion that spoke of repetition far beyond basic training. She didn't run faster than anyone else, didn't complete obstacles more quickly, but she never wasted movement, never took an extra step, never used more energy than necessary. Her breathing stayed controlled, her form stayed consistent, and her pace never varied regardless of the difficulty of the task. Specialist Rodriguez began paying closer attention after their first live-fire exercise at the range. He had been assigned as Rachel's battle buddy for the qualification shoot, responsible for observing her technique and ensuring range safety procedures were followed. What he saw confused him. Rachel approached the firing line with the same quiet competence she displayed everywhere else. But when she settled into position, something changed. Her body language shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more focused, more deliberate. She adjusted her protective equipment with practiced efficiency, checked her weapon with movements that suggested muscle memory rather than recent training, and waited for commands with stillness that seemed deeper than mere discipline. When the order came to commence firing, Rachel's performance was textbook perfect. Not exceptional, not impressive, just exactly what the standard required. She fired her 40 rounds in the allotted time, achieved a qualifying score, and cleared her weapon according to procedure. But Rodriguez noticed things that bothered him afterward. Her shooting stance had been flawless from the first round. Most soldiers required correction, adjustment, coaching to achieve proper form. Rachel had simply assumed the position and maintained it throughout the exercise. Her trigger control was consistent, her breathing rhythm was natural, and her shot group was tight enough to suggest far more practice than her personnel file indicated. More disturbing was what happened between strings of fire. While other soldiers fidgeted, adjusted their positions, or sought guidance from the range cadre, Rachel had remained motionless except for the mechanical actions required to reload and engage new targets. She hadn't looked around, hadn't sought reassurance, hadn't shown any of the nervous energy that characterized soldiers working to prove themselves. "How long did you say you've been in the army?" Rodriguez asked her as they walked back from the range. 18 months, Rachel replied without elaboration. "And this was your first time on this range?" "Yes." Rodriguez wanted to ask more questions, but something in Rachel's tone discouraged further inquiry. She answered what was asked, provided the information requested, and offered nothing beyond the minimum requirement. It was a communication style that suggested either extreme shyness or deliberate evasion, and Rodriguez was beginning to suspect it wasn't shyness. The most significant crack in Rachel's facade occurred during a combat skills training exercise designed to evaluate soldiers' ability to react under pressure. The scenario involved responding to simulated enemy contact while moving through an urban environment constructed from plywood and shipping containers. Soldiers were expected to work in teams, communicate effectively, and demonstrate basic tactical movements they had learned in previous training. Rachel was assigned to a 4-person team led by Corporal Stevens, a competent leader with 2 deployments under his belt. The team also included Private First Class Johnson, an eager soldier with more enthusiasm than experience, and Private Cooper, who was still learning to balance aggression with discipline. Stevens had briefed the exercise carefully, assigning sectors of responsibility and establishing communication procedures. The exercise began routinely. Stevens led the team through the simulated urban area, calling out directions and maintaining the kind of tactical discipline expected in training. Johnson followed orders eagerly, if not always smoothly. Cooper struggled slightly with the coordination required for team movement, and Rachel moved silently behind them, maintaining her position and following instructions without comment. Halfway through the exercise, the scenario changed. Opposing force personnel initiated simulated contact from multiple positions, using blank ammunition and pyrotechnic devices to create realistic stress. Stevens immediately began issuing orders to establish defensive positions and return fire. Johnson responded with enthusiasm but limited effectiveness. Cooper froze momentarily before following Stevens' directions. Rachel simply moved. Her reaction was instantaneous and automatic. Before Stevens finished his first command, Rachel had identified cover, assessed fields of fire, and positioned herself to provide overlapping support for the team. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, without the hesitation or uncertainty that characterized soldiers still learning to apply classroom instruction under stress. More telling was her tactical awareness. While other team members focused on their immediate responsibilities, Rachel maintained situational awareness of the entire engagement area. She identified threats that others missed, anticipated movements before they occurred, and positioned herself to respond to developing situations before they became critical. Stevens noticed immediately. As team leader, he was responsible for controlling the engagement and ensuring all team members performed their assigned roles. What he saw was a soldier who didn't need control, who anticipated requirements and responded to threats with competence that exceeded the training level of everyone else in the exercise. "Torres," he called during a brief lull in the simulated fighting. "Maintain your position and continue suppressive fire." "Roger," Rachel replied, but her hands were already moving to implement the instruction before Stevens had finished speaking. When the exercise concluded, Stevens gathered his team for the standard after-action review. They discussed what had gone well, what needed improvement, and what lessons they had learned from the experience. Rachel participated when directly asked but offered no insights, no suggestions, no observations that might indicate she had noticed things others had missed. But Stevens had noticed. During the debriefing with the cadre, he mentioned Rachel's performance to Sergeant First Class Morrison. "The new girl, Torres. She's good." Morrison looked up from his notes. "Good how?" "Good like she's done this before. Real good. Like, maybe too good for someone who's supposed to be learning this stuff for the first time." Morrison made another note in his leader book. The comments about Rachel were accumulating, all pointing in the same direction. Too competent, too smooth, too comfortable with situations that should have been challenging for someone at her experience level. That evening, First Sergeant Patterson reviewed the training reports from the day's exercises. Multiple instructors had noted Rachel's performance, all using variations of the same language, exceeded expectations, demonstrated advanced competence, requires minimal supervision. The comments were positive, but they raised questions about why a soldier with such obvious capability was content to remain invisible among her peers. Patterson decided to conduct her own observation during the next training cycle. She positioned herself where she could watch Rachel without being obvious about it, studying the small details that might explain the inconsistency between Rachel's apparent inexperience and her demonstrated competence. What Patterson saw confirmed her growing suspicions. Rachel moved like a veteran, thought like someone who had been tested under real conditions, and performed like someone who was deliberately holding back rather than pushing forward. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for, but it required experience to recognize it. Young soldiers with real combat experience often struggled with the transition back to training environments. They had difficulty pretending that simulated dangers felt threatening, that training scenarios carried real consequences, that garrison routines mattered as much as survival. Most adapted by becoming aggressive, impatient, or dismissive of peacetime procedures. Rachel had adapted differently. She had learned to perform just well enough to avoid attention while hiding capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions. She participated in training exercises as if learning skills she had already mastered, asked questions about procedures she clearly understood, and maintained the fiction that everything was new to her. It was a sophisticated form of camouflage, and it would have worked perfectly if she had been able to control every micro-expression, every automatic response, every moment of competence that leaked through her carefully constructed facade. But competence, once earned through experience that matters, never completely disappears. And people who know what to look for can always spot the signs, even when someone works very hard to hide them. The question Patterson faced was whether Rachel was hiding her experience to avoid responsibility, avoid attention, or avoid something else entirely. The answer would determine whether she was a problem that needed solving or an asset that needed proper utilization. Either way, the fiction that Rachel Torres was just another unremarkable soldier was beginning to collapse under the weight of accumulated evidence. Soon, someone would ask the right questions, and Rachel would have to decide whether to continue hiding or finally reveal what she had been carrying alone. The transformation from isolated observations to group consensus happened gradually. Then suddenly, what began as private doubts shared between individual soldiers evolved into a collective suspicion that something about Rachel Torres didn't match the story she presented. The change started in the barracks during evening downtime, when soldiers had opportunity to compare notes and validate their individual observations. Private Kane had been keeping her own informal record of Rachel's inconsistencies, noting them in margins of training manuals and on scraps of paper she kept in her wall locker. The habit had started as curiosity but was becoming something closer to investigation. During a quiet evening in late April, she decided to share her findings with others who might have noticed similar patterns. "I think Torres is lying about something," Kane announced to the small group gathered around the common area television. The statement landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of attention that spread through soldiers who had been only half listening to the conversation. "Lying about what?" asked Private First Class Johnson, looking up from the letter he was writing to his girlfriend back home. Kane pulled out her collection of observations, organized now into categories that painted a disturbing picture. Her equipment knowledge is too advanced. Her physical fitness is too consistent. Her weapon handling is too smooth. And yesterday, during the first aid training, she corrected the instructor without realizing she was doing it. The incident Kane referenced had occurred during a combat lifesaver course designed to teach basic medical procedures to soldiers who might need to treat wounded personnel in the field. The instructor, Staff Sergeant Williams, had been demonstrating proper technique for applying pressure dressings to control bleeding from extremity wounds. Williams had made a small error in his demonstration, placing the dressing slightly off-center and applying pressure at an angle that would have been less effective in controlling actual hemorrhage. It was a minor mistake, the kind that happened when muscle memory competed with teaching points, but it was technically incorrect according to current medical doctrine. Rachel had raised her hand and pointed out the error, speaking clearly and specifically about proper placement and pressure application. Her correction was accurate, professional, and delivered with confidence that suggested familiarity with the subject matter beyond basic training. Williams had accepted the correction gracefully, adjusted his demonstration, and continued with the class. But Kane had noticed the way Rachel's face changed immediately after she spoke, as if she realized she had revealed more knowledge than she intended. For the remainder of the class, Rachel had returned to her usual pattern of attentive silence, asking only basic questions and offering no additional insights. "Maybe she's just smart," suggested Specialist Martinez, though his tone carried doubt. "Some people pick things up faster than others." "Smart doesn't explain muscle memory," Kane replied. "Smart doesn't explain knowing things that aren't in the training manuals we've been given. Smart doesn't explain moving like you've done something 1,000 times when you're supposed to be learning it for the first time." The group fell silent as they processed Kane's observations. Each soldier began reviewing their own interactions with Rachel, looking for moments that might support or contradict Kane's theory. The review was uncomfortable because it forced them to acknowledge that they had been accepting Rachel's story without question, assuming that quiet competence was the same as inexperience. Corporal Stevens had perhaps the most damaging evidence to offer. During his after-action review following the combat skills exercise, he had mentioned Rachel's performance to other team leaders. Their responses had been revealing. Rodriguez said she moved through his urban operations lane like she was following a map, Stevens told the group. Morrison said she demonstrated immediate action drills during weapons training like she was teaching the class. Jackson said she coordinated with his team during the field exercise like she'd been doing small unit tactics for years. The pattern was clear once laid out systematically. Multiple instructors, multiple exercises, multiple situations where Rachel had demonstrated knowledge or skills that exceeded what her personnel file suggested she should possess. Individually, each incident could be explained as exceptional aptitude or lucky intuition. Collectively, they painted a picture of someone with training and experience she wasn't acknowledging. "So what do you think her real story is?" asked Private Cooper, leaning forward with the kind of interest that suggested he was ready to believe whatever theory sounded most dramatic. Kane shrugged. "I don't know. But I know it's not what she's telling us." The conversation continued for another hour, with soldiers sharing additional observations and building theories about what Rachel might be hiding. Some suggestions were reasonable. Perhaps she had prior military experience in another service branch, or maybe she had received additional training that wasn't reflected in her current assignment. Other theories were more exotic: special operations background, intelligence work, witness protection. All of the theories shared one common element. They assumed Rachel was deliberately concealing her true background rather than simply being modest about her capabilities. The assumption felt justified given the systematic nature of the discrepancies, but it also created a new dynamic within the unit. Soldiers who had previously ignored Rachel began watching her more carefully, looking for evidence that would support or refute the emerging consensus. Those who had noticed her competence but dismissed it as individual excellence began reconsidering their observations in light of the broader pattern. And those who had genuinely missed her capabilities began feeling foolish for accepting surface appearances without deeper investigation. The shift in attention created pressure that Rachel couldn't ignore. She began to notice soldiers watching her during training exercises, studying her reactions during instruction, and paying closer attention to her responses during group discussions. The comfortable anonymity she had worked to maintain was eroding, replaced by scrutiny that made invisibility impossible. Rachel's response was to become even more deliberately average. She started making small, obvious mistakes during training exercises, nothing dangerous or incompetent, but enough to suggest she was still learning basic skills. She asked more questions during instruction, sometimes about topics she clearly understood, and she made sure her performance stayed closer to the middle of the acceptable range rather than at the high end. But overcompensation created its own problems. Soldiers who had been watching for signs of exceptional competence now noticed her deliberate mediocrity, and deliberate mediocrity was almost as revealing as uncontrolled excellence. Someone who had to work to appear average was probably above average. Someone who had to remember to make mistakes probably didn't make them naturally. First Sergeant Patterson had been monitoring the situation through her network of squad leaders and team chiefs, all of whom reported growing questions about Rachel's background. The questions weren't necessarily hostile, but they represented a breakdown in unit cohesion that could become problematic if left unaddressed. During her weekly meeting with Captain Williams, Patterson brought up the issue directly. "Sir, we have a situation developing with Private Torres that needs command attention." Williams looked up from the training schedule he was reviewing. "What kind of situation?" "Questions about her background. Multiple soldiers have noticed inconsistencies between her apparent experience level and her demonstrated competence. The questions are starting to affect unit dynamics." Patterson handed Williams a summary of the observations she had collected from various sources. The document was thorough and professional, laying out facts without speculation, but the implications were clear. Either Rachel Torres had received training she wasn't acknowledging, or she possessed experience that wasn't reflected in her personnel file. Williams read the summary carefully, his expression becoming more serious as he processed the information. As company commander, he was responsible for knowing his soldiers' capabilities and backgrounds. If one of his soldiers was concealing relevant experience, it represented both a potential security issue and a missed opportunity for proper utilization of resources. "What's your recommendation, First Sergeant?" "We need to have a direct conversation with Private Torres. If she has additional training or experience, we need to know about it. If there are reasons she's not disclosing her background, we need to understand what those reasons are." Williams nodded. "Set up a meeting. Make it informal, not disciplinary. I want to give her the opportunity to explain before we make any assumptions about why she's been less than forthcoming." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, giving Rachel several days to notice the increased attention and prepare for whatever questions might be coming. During those days, the speculation among her fellow soldiers continued to build, fed by new observations and creative interpretations of her behavior. Some soldiers began treating her with increased respect, assuming she must have impressive credentials if she was working so hard to hide them. Others became suspicious, wondering what she might be hiding and whether it represented a threat to the unit. Still others simply became curious, eager to solve the puzzle she represented. Rachel recognized that her situation was becoming untenable. The careful balance she had maintained between competence and invisibility was collapsing under sustained scrutiny. Soon, she would be forced to choose between continuing a deception that was no longer working or revealing truths she had hoped to keep buried. The choice would be made for her when Drill Sergeant Hayes grabbed her collar during the battalion review. But the foundation for that moment was being laid during these quiet April evenings when soldiers sat in barracks and tried to figure out who Rachel Torres really was. By the time the formal questions came, everyone already suspected the answers would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet soldier who had been hiding among them in plain sight. The breakthrough came during a night navigation exercise that should have been routine but became the moment when Rachel's carefully constructed facade finally cracked beyond repair. The exercise was designed to test basic land navigation skills using compass and map, with soldiers working in pairs to locate predetermined checkpoints scattered across the wooded training area adjacent to Fort Cumberland. Rachel had been paired with Private First Class Davidson, a reliable soldier who approached tasks methodically but lacked the intuitive understanding of terrain that came with extensive field experience. Davidson was competent enough to avoid getting them lost, but not experienced enough to recognize when his partner was subtly guiding their movement through techniques he had never been taught. The exercise began at 2,100 hours under a moonless sky that reduced visibility to what their issued red lens flashlights could provide. Davidson took point as the senior member of the team, consulting his compass and map while Rachel followed at the prescribed distance. Their first checkpoint was located approximately 2 kilometers northeast of their starting position, requiring movement through mixed terrain including open fields, wooded areas, and a small creek that appeared on their maps as a thin blue line. Davidson navigated competently for the first kilometer, maintaining proper direction and identifying terrain features that confirmed their position. Rachel followed without comment, staying in her assigned position and maintaining the illusion that she was learning navigation techniques rather than constantly evaluating their route for efficiency and security. But as they entered the wooded area that surrounded their first checkpoint, Davidson began to struggle with the complexity of maintaining direction while avoiding obstacles. The trees blocked most ambient light, the undergrowth created numerous detours, and the straight-line distance to their objective became a series of zigzag movements around terrain features that weren't detailed enough on their maps to predict. Rachel watched Davidson's confidence erode as the simple navigation problem became complicated by real-world conditions. She could see him checking and rechecking his compass, comparing map features with what little terrain he could observe, and growing increasingly uncertain about their location relative to their objective. What Davidson couldn't see but Rachel could was that they were being observed. The exercise included opposition force personnel whose mission was to detect and capture student teams who failed to maintain proper noise discipline and tactical movement. The opposing force moved through the same terrain using night vision equipment and sound discipline that made them nearly invisible to students relying on flashlights and uncertain navigation. Rachel had detected the first observer approximately 15 minutes into their movement through the woods. A slight sound that didn't match the natural rhythm of the forest. A shadow that moved when wind patterns wouldn't have caused movement. A sense of presence that came from having learned to notice when she was being watched. Davidson remained unaware of the observers, focused entirely on the navigation problem, and growing more frustrated with each minute they spent moving through terrain that seemed designed to confuse rather than educate. Rachel faced a choice. Maintain her cover and allow Davidson to lead them into what was becoming an obvious ambush, or reveal capabilities she had worked months to conceal. The choice was made for her when Davidson stopped to check their position and turned on his flashlight to read the map more clearly. The white light destroyed their night vision, announced their position to anyone within several hundred meters, and created a perfect target for the opposing force team that had been tracking their movement. Rachel moved before conscious thought took over. Her hand covered Davidson's flashlight, extinguishing the beam while her other hand pulled him down into a crouch behind the largest nearby tree. The movement was fluid, silent, and automatic, the kind of reaction that comes from muscle memory developed under conditions where mistakes have permanent consequences. Contact left, approximately 100 meters, Rachel whispered directly into Davidson's ear, her voice so quiet it was barely audible even at point-blank range. 3 personnel moving to flank our position. We need to displace north and east. Avoid the obvious route to the checkpoint. Davidson stared at her in the darkness, his night vision slowly returning but his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Rachel had not only detected threats he couldn't see or hear, but she was providing tactical guidance with specificity that suggested professional training far beyond basic infantry skills. "How do you?" Davidson began, but Rachel cut him off with a gesture that somehow conveyed absolute urgency without visible movement. "Questions later. Move now. Stay low, watch where you step, maintain noise discipline. Follow my movement." What happened next would be discussed in barracks conversations for weeks afterward, though Davidson struggled to find words that adequately described Rachel's transformation from quiet follower to tactical leader. She moved through the forest with confidence that bordered on supernatural, avoiding obstacles that Davidson couldn't see, stepping around areas that would have created noise, navigating between trees with efficiency that suggested she could see the terrain clearly despite the darkness. More importantly, she demonstrated situational awareness that allowed her to avoid the opposing force personnel who were actively hunting them. Twice she guided Davidson away from routes that would have led directly into observation positions. Once she directed him to freeze in place while an opposing force member passed within 10 meters of their position, close enough that Davidson could hear equipment rattling but couldn't see the person carrying it. They reached their first checkpoint without being detected, despite moving through terrain that had trapped 2 other student teams. Rachel allowed Davidson to locate the actual checkpoint marker and record their time, maintaining the fiction that he was leading the exercise while she provided only subtle guidance. But the fiction was becoming harder to maintain with each demonstration of competence that exceeded anything Davidson had learned in basic training. When they began movement toward their second checkpoint, Davidson confronted the issue directly. "Torres, what's your real background?" Rachel continued moving, maintaining their pace and direction without acknowledging the question immediately. When she finally responded, her voice carried resignation that suggested she knew her cover was becoming untenable. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. Nobody learns that stuff in basic training. Nobody moves like that without real experience. Nobody detects threats like that without having been in situations where detecting threats mattered." They reached their second checkpoint in half the time it should have taken, using routes that avoided both terrain obstacles and opposing force positions. Davidson completed the required administrative tasks while mentally cataloging everything he had observed about Rachel's capabilities. The final checkpoint required movement across open terrain that offered no concealment from observation. Standard doctrine called for careful reconnaissance, planned routes that minimized exposure time, and movement techniques that reduced the probability of detection. Davidson had learned the theory but had never applied it under conditions where failure meant more than a poor grade. Rachel had clearly applied it under conditions where failure meant something much more serious. She guided them through the open area using movement techniques that Davidson recognized from advanced training manuals but had never seen demonstrated. Bounds between covered positions, careful timing that took advantage of cloud cover to reduce visibility, and coordination that allowed them to maintain mutual support while minimizing their exposure profile. They completed the exercise in record time without being detected by opposing force personnel who had successfully interdicted most other student teams. When they returned to the assembly area, Davidson was prepared to share his observations with anyone who would listen. But Rachel's transformation back to quiet competence was as dramatic as her earlier display of tactical expertise. By the time they conducted their after-action review with the cadre, she had resumed the persona of a student learning basic skills, asking appropriate questions and offering no insights that might reveal her true capabilities. Davidson found himself in the awkward position of trying to describe events that sounded impossible when attributed to someone with Rachel's supposed experience level. His account was accurate but incredible, detailed but unbelievable to anyone who hadn't witnessed her performance directly. The exercise cadre noted Davidson's comments but interpreted them as the kind of exaggeration that sometimes occurred when soldiers wanted to make their training experiences sound more dramatic than they actually were. Rachel's official performance was recorded as satisfactory, meeting all required standards without exceptional achievement. But Davidson's story spread through Bravo Company like wildfire, adding new evidence to the growing collection of observations that suggested Rachel Torres was not who she claimed to be. Soldiers who had previously dismissed rumors about her background began reconsidering their assumptions. Those who had noticed inconsistencies felt validated in their suspicions. And those who had defended her story as simply reflecting natural talent began questioning whether natural talent could explain everything they had heard. The exercise marked the end of Rachel's ability to maintain her cover through careful performance management. Too many soldiers had now witnessed capabilities that couldn't be explained by basic training or natural aptitude. Too many questions had been raised to ignore. Too many inconsistencies had accumulated to dismiss. The only question remaining was whether Rachel would voluntarily reveal her background or wait for someone with sufficient authority to demand answers. That moment was approaching faster than she realized, and when it came, her response would determine not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The crisis that would force Rachel's hand arrived disguised as routine training, but escalated into something that threatened not just her cover but the safety of her fellow soldiers. The incident began during a live-fire exercise at the Fort Cumberland Range Complex, where Bravo Company was conducting squad-level tactical movements with actual ammunition, the kind of training where small mistakes could have permanent consequences. The exercise was designed to test fire and movement techniques under realistic conditions. Squads would advance across open terrain while providing mutual support, with some elements laying down suppressive fire while others maneuvered to new positions. It was complex training that required precise coordination, clear communication, and absolute adherence to safety protocols. Rachel had been assigned to 2nd Squad under Sergeant Thompson, a competent leader with solid tactical knowledge but limited experience managing live-fire exercises with soldiers whose capabilities he didn't fully understand. Thompson had briefed the exercise carefully, emphasizing safety procedures and coordination signals, but he was working with personnel whose true skill levels remained largely unknown to him. The squad included Private Kowalski, an eager soldier whose enthusiasm sometimes exceeded his judgment. Specialist Brooks, methodical and reliable but prone to overthinking under pressure. Private First Class Murphy, competent but still learning to balance aggression with discipline. And Rachel, whose capabilities Thompson was beginning to suspect exceeded what her personnel file suggested. The exercise began smoothly. Thompson controlled the movement effectively, coordinating with adjacent squads and maintaining proper spacing between elements. The squad advanced across the first phase line without incident, demonstrating textbook fire and movement techniques while maintaining appropriate safety margins. But during the second phase of the exercise, the complexity increased significantly. The scenario required squads to coordinate simultaneous movements while engaging targets at varying distances, with overlapping fields of fire that demanded precise control to avoid fratricide incidents. Radio communications became congested as multiple squad leaders attempted to coordinate their actions simultaneously. Thompson found himself managing more variables than his training had prepared him for. He was tracking his own squad's movement, monitoring adjacent units to avoid conflicts, communicating with higher headquarters about timing and objectives, and trying to maintain situational awareness of a rapidly evolving tactical picture. The breakdown began when Kowalski misunderstood a movement signal and began advancing during a period when he should have remained in position providing covering fire. His movement put him in the direct line of fire for the adjacent squad, which was preparing to engage targets in his direction. Thompson saw the problem developing but was simultaneously dealing with a radio malfunction that prevented him from communicating with the other squad leader. Brooks recognized the danger and attempted to signal Kowalski to halt his movement, but Kowalski was focused on what he thought were his instructions and didn't see Brooks's frantic gestures. Murphy saw the problem as well and started moving to intercept Kowalski, but his movement would take him across the line of fire for yet another element, potentially creating a second fratricide hazard. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with multiple soldiers moving in directions that would place them in extreme danger within seconds. Thompson was shouting commands that couldn't be heard over the sound of gunfire. Radio communications were failing at the critical moment, and the exercise was about to become a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved. Rachel moved without hesitation or authorization. Her first action was to launch herself toward Kowalski with speed and precision that suggested she had calculated trajectory, timing, and impact force before she began moving. She covered 20 meters in seconds, staying low to avoid the fields of fire while maintaining awareness of all other personnel positions. She reached Kowalski just as he entered the danger area, taking him down with a tackle that was controlled enough to avoid injury but forceful enough to remove him from immediate danger. But taking down Kowalski was only the first part of a complex solution she was implementing in real time. Even as she was bringing Kowalski to the ground, Rachel was signaling to Brooks with hand and arm gestures that communicated precise instructions about fields of fire and target engagement. The signals were not standard infantry signals taught in basic training. They were specialized communication techniques used by units that operated in environments where radio silence was mandatory and coordination had to be maintained through visual cues alone. Brooks responded to the signals immediately, though he later admitted he acted on instinct rather than conscious recognition of what the gestures meant. He shifted his position and adjusted his field of fire exactly as Rachel had indicated, creating a safe corridor for Murphy's movement while maintaining effective coverage of the assigned target area. But Rachel's most impressive action was her immediate assessment of the entire tactical situation and her rapid communication with multiple squad elements to restore coordination. Using a combination of hand signals, movement cues, and positioning, she managed to restore tactical discipline to a situation that had been seconds away from disaster. The entire intervention lasted less than 30 seconds, but in that time Rachel had demonstrated tactical awareness, leadership ability, and technical competence that belonged to someone with extensive combat experience and advanced training. She had not only prevented potential casualties but had done so while maintaining the tactical integrity of the exercise. When the immediate danger passed, Rachel immediately attempted to return to her previous role as a junior member of Thompson's squad. She helped Kowalski to his feet, checked him for injuries, and resumed her assigned position as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Thompson was staring at her with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and dawning recognition. "Torres," Thompson called out during the administrative pause that followed the incident. Where did you learn those signals? Rachel maintained her usual neutral expression, but Thompson could see something change in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested she knew her cover was about to be blown completely. What signals, Sergeant? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The hand and arm signals you used to coordinate with Brooks. Those aren't standard infantry signals. I've never seen them before, but Brooks responded like he'd been trained on them. Brooks looked confused. I don't know why I understood them, he admitted, but they were clear as hell. I knew exactly what she wanted me to do. Thompson continued his questioning, but his tone was becoming more respectful, as if he was beginning to understand that he was talking to someone whose experience might exceed his own. And that tactical assessment, how did you see the whole picture so quickly? How did you know where everyone was positioned and how to coordinate the solution? Rachel remained silent for several seconds, and Thompson could see her weighing options that probably included continuing her deception, revealing partial truths, or acknowledging capabilities she had worked months to conceal. Training, Sergeant, she finally replied, but her voice lacked the conviction that might have made the answer believable. What kind of training? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the squad was listening now, not just Thompson but Kowalski, Brooks, and Murphy, all of whom had witnessed Rachel's intervention and recognized that it represented something far beyond basic infantry skills. Before Rachel could answer, the range safety officer approached Thompson's position. Staff Sergeant Martinez had been observing the exercise from an elevated position that gave him oversight of all squad movements, and he had seen the entire incident develop and resolve. Sergeant Thompson, Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled range safety and could shut down any exercise that posed unacceptable risks. I need to speak with Private Torres. Rachel's expression didn't change, but Thompson could see her body language shift almost imperceptibly, as if she was preparing for a confrontation she had been hoping to avoid. Martinez continued, addressing Rachel directly. Private, I observed your actions during the safety incident. Your response was immediate, comprehensive, and technically proficient. Those are not capabilities that develop through basic training or casual instruction. Rachel met Martinez's eyes steadily. I don't understand what you're asking, Staff Sergeant. I'm asking where you learned tactical coordination techniques that I haven't seen since I worked with special operations personnel in Afghanistan. I'm asking how you developed situational awareness that allowed you to manage a complex tactical picture while simultaneously executing a physical intervention. I'm asking why someone with your obvious capabilities is assigned to a basic infantry unit as if she's learning skills she clearly already possesses. The conversation was taking place in front of Rachel's entire squad, with other personnel from adjacent squads beginning to take notice. The exercise had been suspended pending resolution of the safety incident, which meant that Rachel's performance was about to become the subject of immediate and intense scrutiny from cadre who had the authority to demand explanations. Martinez looked directly at Thompson. Sergeant, I recommend you submit an incident report that includes detailed observations about Private Torres's actions. This needs to go to company level for review. Thompson nodded, understanding that the incident had moved beyond squad-level management. Roger, Staff Sergeant. I'll have the report completed by close of business. As Martinez walked away to coordinate resumption of the exercise, Thompson looked at Rachel with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something approaching respect mixed with concern. Torres, he said quietly, I don't know what your story is, but I know you probably just saved lives today. Whatever you're not telling us, we're going to find out. The question is whether you want to tell us yourself or wait for someone else to figure it out. Rachel looked around at her squad members, all of whom were watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to admiration to uncertainty. The comfortable anonymity she had maintained for months was gone, replaced by a tension that would only intensify as word of her performance spread through the company. For the first time since arriving at Fort Cumberland, Rachel Torres faced a choice that couldn't be avoided, delayed, or deflected. The incident report would trigger questions she couldn't answer without revealing truths she had hoped to keep buried. The scrutiny would continue until someone with sufficient authority demanded explanations she couldn't provide without acknowledging capabilities that didn't match her supposed background. The moment when Drill Sergeant Hayes would grab her collar was still weeks away, but the foundation for that confrontation was being laid on a firing range where Rachel Torres had chosen to save lives rather than preserve her cover. The incident report that Sergeant Thompson submitted to company headquarters landed on First Sergeant Patterson's desk with the impact of a small explosion. Written in the careful, precise language that non-commissioned officers used when they knew their words would be scrutinized by higher authority, the report detailed Rachel's actions during the live-fire exercise with clinical accuracy that made her capabilities impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Thompson had documented everything: her instantaneous tactical assessment, her coordinated intervention that prevented multiple potential casualties, her use of specialized hand signals that weren't part of standard infantry training, and her immediate attempt to minimize attention after demonstrating skills that belonged to someone with extensive combat experience. The report concluded with Thompson's professional assessment that Private Torres possessed training and experience that significantly exceeded what her personnel file indicated. Patterson read the report 3 times before calling Captain Williams to schedule an immediate meeting. This was no longer a situation that could be managed at the first sergeant level through informal counseling or administrative guidance. The discrepancy between Rachel's apparent background and demonstrated capabilities had moved from speculation to documented fact, witnessed by multiple personnel and recorded by a range safety officer whose observations carried significant weight. Captain Williams reviewed the report with the focused attention of a commander who recognized that personnel issues could escalate quickly if not handled properly. The Army had specific procedures for addressing situations where soldiers might have undisclosed backgrounds, and those procedures existed because such situations could represent security risks, administrative errors, or individuals who needed specialized support. First Sergeant, what's your assessment of the situation? Patterson had prepared for this question by conducting her own investigation into Rachel's behavior patterns over the previous months. Her response was comprehensive and troubling. Sir, we have a soldier whose demonstrated capabilities consistently exceed her supposed training and experience level. The pattern has been developing since she arrived, but the range incident represents undeniable evidence that she possesses skills she shouldn't have. Either her personnel file is incomplete, or she's deliberately concealing her background. Williams considered the implications. Incomplete personnel files could indicate administrative errors that needed correction. Deliberate concealment could indicate security issues, legal problems, or medical conditions that affected her suitability for continued service. Either possibility required investigation that went beyond company-level resources. What's our next step? We need to conduct a formal counseling session with Private Torres. Give her the opportunity to explain the discrepancies before we escalate to battalion level. If she provides information that resolves our concerns, we can address it administratively. If she continues to maintain her current story despite evidence to the contrary, we'll need to involve military intelligence for a background verification. The mention of military intelligence investigation carried weight that both officers understood. Such investigations were thorough, invasive, and permanent. Once initiated, they continued until every discrepancy was resolved, every question was answered, and every aspect of a soldier's background was verified through independent sources. Soldiers who became subjects of MI investigations often found their careers permanently affected, regardless of the ultimate findings. Williams approved the counseling session, scheduling it for the following Monday to give Rachel time to prepare mentally for questions she had probably been dreading since her arrival at Fort Cumberland. The delay also allowed Patterson to coordinate with battalion headquarters about potential next steps, ensuring that appropriate resources would be available if the counseling session raised additional concerns. Word of the impending counseling session spread through Bravo Company with the speed that rumors always traveled in military units. Soldiers who had been speculating about Rachel's background suddenly found their theories validated by official attention. Those who had defended her story began reconsidering their positions. And those who had worked closely with Rachel during training exercises began reviewing their experiences for details they might have missed. The speculation intensified over the weekend, fed by multiple retellings of Thompson's incident report and creative interpretations of Rachel's behavior during previous training events. Some soldiers suggested she might be an undercover inspector testing unit readiness. Others theorized that she was a special operations soldier recovering from medical issues who had been assigned to a regular unit for rehabilitation. Still others proposed more exotic explanations involving intelligence work or witness protection. Rachel herself seemed to recognize that her situation was approaching a critical point. Soldiers who observed her during the weekend noted changes in her behavior that suggested she was preparing for confrontation. She spent more time alone, avoided casual conversations, and maintained an even more disciplined routine than usual. Her physical training became more intense, her equipment maintenance more meticulous, and her overall bearing more precisely military. But the most significant change was her interaction with other soldiers. Where she had previously maintained friendly but distant relationships, she began engaging in conversations that carried undertones of farewell. She thanked soldiers for their assistance during training, expressed appreciation for their professionalism, and offered advice about techniques and procedures that demonstrated knowledge she had never previously acknowledged possessing. Private Davidson, her partner during the night navigation exercise, later described one such conversation as feeling like someone was preparing to disappear. Rachel had approached him privately and provided detailed feedback about his navigation techniques, offering suggestions that reflected deep understanding of advanced land navigation principles. When Davidson asked where she had learned such techniques, Rachel had simply said that experience was a teacher that some people met earlier than others. Specialist Rodriguez noticed similar changes during their final weekend training preparation. Rachel had volunteered to help him with equipment maintenance, demonstrating procedures for caring for weapons and gear that exceeded standard requirements. Her techniques were efficient, professional, and obviously developed through extensive practice under field conditions. When Rodriguez complimented her knowledge, Rachel had responded that taking care of equipment was how soldiers took care of each other. The weekend conversations created an atmosphere of anticipation that affected the entire company. Soldiers found themselves paying closer attention to Rachel's words and actions, looking for clues about what Monday's counseling session might reveal. Some hoped for dramatic revelations that would validate their most creative theories. Others worried that the truth might be more complicated than any of their speculations suggested. First Sergeant Patterson used the weekend to prepare her own approach to the counseling session. She reviewed Rachel's complete personnel file, noting discrepancies and gaps that might provide clues about her background. She consulted with other senior non-commissioned officers about techniques for conducting interviews with soldiers who might be reluctant to discuss their experiences. And she coordinated with mental health services to ensure appropriate support would be available if the session revealed traumatic experiences that required professional intervention. The preparation reflected Patterson's recognition that Monday's meeting could go in multiple directions. If Rachel had concealed combat experience due to post-traumatic stress or other medical conditions, the revelation could trigger psychological reactions that required immediate support. If she had legal issues in her background, the session might need to be suspended pending consultation with military justice personnel. If she had security clearances or specialized training that explained her capabilities, the discussion might need to involve personnel with appropriate authorization to access classified information. By Sunday evening, the anticipation had reached levels that affected normal company operations. Soldiers were distracted during routine activities, conversations frequently turned to speculation about Rachel's background, and productivity decreased as attention focused on the impending confrontation that everyone expected to provide answers to months of accumulated questions. Rachel spent Sunday evening in her usual routine, maintaining equipment and preparing for Monday's training schedule as if nothing unusual was about to happen. But soldiers who observed her closely noted subtle signs of tension that suggested she was not as calm as she appeared. Her movements were slightly more precise, her posture slightly more controlled, and her expression slightly more neutral than normal. Changes that might have been invisible to casual observation but were apparent to people who had learned to watch for details. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Rachel to choose between continuing a deception that was no longer sustainable or revealing truths that would fundamentally change how everyone at Fort Cumberland understood her story. The choice she made would determine not only her own future, but the future of relationships she had built with soldiers who had accepted her at face value while remaining unaware of the weight she carried alone. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of late spring in Virginia, And with it came the moment when months of accumulated questions would finally demand answers that could no longer be delayed, deflected, or denied. The formal counseling session scheduled for Monday morning became secondary to events that began unfolding at 0530 hours, when Fort Cumberland received an emergency notification that would transform routine garrison operations into something resembling wartime conditions. The alert came through multiple channels simultaneously: base security, military police, and command networks, all carrying the same urgent message. A training accident at the nearby Quantico Marine Base had resulted in multiple casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation to facilities capable of handling complex trauma cases. Fort Cumberland's medical facility was designated as the primary receiving hospital for overflow casualties that exceeded Quantico's immediate treatment capacity. Within minutes of the initial notification, the base transformed from sleepy Monday morning routine into controlled chaos as medical personnel, security teams, and support units mobilized to receive an unknown number of wounded Marines whose injuries ranged from serious to life-threatening. Captain Williams received the alert while reviewing notes for Rachel's counseling session. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had planned to spend the morning investigating one soldier's concealed background, but instead found himself managing a real-world emergency that would test every soldier's actual capabilities under conditions that couldn't be simulated or rehearsed. First Sergeant Williams called to Patterson, who was coordinating company response to the emergency notification. "Cancel the counseling session. We're going to need every available body for casualty support operations." Bravo Company was tasked with providing security cordons, traffic control, and general support for medical operations that were expected to continue throughout the day. It was the kind of mission that required competent execution of basic tasks while maintaining flexibility to respond to changing requirements. Exactly the type of operation where hidden capabilities might reveal themselves under pressure. Rachel received the emergency notification along with everyone else in the company, but her reaction differed subtly from her fellow soldiers in ways that suggested she understood implications others were still processing. While most soldiers focused on immediate task assignments and equipment requirements, Rachel's attention seemed to shift to broader operational considerations: medical facility capacity, evacuation timeline management, and coordination challenges that would emerge as multiple agencies attempted to work together under time pressure. The first helicopters arrived at 0645 hours, their rotors creating dust clouds that reduced visibility across the landing zone, while medical teams rushed to transfer casualties from aircraft to waiting ambulances. The operation was proceeding smoothly until the fourth helicopter encountered mechanical problems during landing, executing a hard touchdown that damaged landing gear and created a secondary emergency within the primary response. The damaged helicopter blocked half of the designated landing zone just as additional aircraft were approaching with critical casualties aboard. Air traffic controllers scrambled to establish alternative landing areas while ground crews worked to clear the disabled aircraft, but the disruption threatened to create dangerous delays in medical treatment for wounded personnel whose conditions were already serious. Rachel observed the developing crisis from her assigned position at the security perimeter, where she was supposed to maintain access control while the aviation emergency unfolded. Standard protocol called for security personnel to maintain their positions and allow specialized teams to handle aircraft emergencies. But Rachel could see that the specialized teams were overwhelmed by the complexity of managing multiple simultaneous problems. The situation deteriorated when the fifth incoming helicopter, carrying 2 critically wounded Marines, was forced into a holding pattern because the primary landing zone was blocked and the alternative sites weren't yet prepared to receive aircraft. The pilot reported fuel concerns that would soon force him to land at a more distant facility, potentially costing precious minutes that the casualties aboard his aircraft couldn't afford to lose. Ground control was coordinating frantically with multiple agencies while aircraft circled overhead burning fuel and carrying patients whose medical conditions were becoming more critical with each minute of delay. The aviation emergency had created a cascade of problems that threatened to overwhelm the entire casualty reception operation. That was when Rachel left her assigned position. Her first action was to approach Staff Sergeant Martinez, who was serving as the senior non-commissioned officer for ground operations. Martinez was juggling radio communications, coordinating with medical personnel, and trying to establish timelines for clearing the blocked landing zone when Rachel appeared beside him. "Staff Sergeant," Rachel said. her voice carrying calm authority that cut through the ambient noise and confusion. "Request permission to assist with landing zone operations." Martinez looked at her with surprise that quickly shifted to relief. He was managing more variables than any single person could effectively control, and he needed competent assistance from someone who understood the complexity of the situation. "What's your background with aviation operations, Torres?" "Sufficient, Staff Sergeant. I can coordinate with air traffic control and manage ground movement to expedite aircraft recovery." Something in Rachel's tone convinced Martinez that she wasn't offering general labor but specific expertise. He handed her a radio and gestured toward the disabled helicopter. "Make it happen, Torres. Those Marines don't have time for us to figure this out slowly." What followed was a demonstration of organizational competence that belonged to someone with extensive experience managing complex operations under pressure. Rachel immediately established communication with air traffic controllers, assessed ground crew capabilities, and coordinated a recovery plan that addressed both immediate aircraft movement and long-term landing zone restoration. But her most impressive achievement was her coordination with the medical teams who were trying to balance urgent patient care with operational efficiency. Rachel somehow understood both medical priorities and aviation requirements well enough to optimize the intersection between them, ensuring that the most critical casualties received priority treatment while maintaining operational flow that prevented additional delays. She directed ground crews through aircraft recovery procedures with precision that suggested deep familiarity with helicopter operations. She coordinated with medical personnel using terminology that demonstrated understanding of trauma care protocols. And she managed communication between multiple agencies with efficiency that indicated extensive experience working in joint operations environments. Within 20 minutes of Rachel's intervention, the disabled helicopter was moved to a maintenance area, alternative landing zones were operational, and the backlog of incoming aircraft was cleared. The two critically wounded Marines in the delayed helicopter reached medical treatment with time margins that medical personnel later credited with saving their lives. But Rachel's performance extended beyond crisis management to the sustained operations that continued throughout the day. As additional casualties arrived and medical requirements evolved, she adapted her support role to meet changing needs while maintaining the operational efficiency that kept aircraft moving and patients receiving appropriate care. Medical personnel began requesting Rachel's assistance specifically because she seemed to understand their requirements intuitively. Air traffic controllers relied on her coordination because she managed ground operations with precision that made their jobs easier. And command personnel found themselves using Rachel as an interface between agencies that might otherwise have struggled to work together effectively. By 1400 hours, when the last casualty had been transferred to appropriate medical care and normal operations were being restored, Rachel had essentially functioned as an operations coordinator for a complex joint mission that involved military medical personnel, civilian emergency services, and multiple aviation assets. Her performance had been noticed by senior personnel from multiple organizations who were trying to understand how a junior enlisted soldier had demonstrated capabilities that typically belonged to experienced officers and senior non-commissioned officers. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, approached Captain Williams during the Operation Wind Down with questions that Williams wasn't prepared to answer. "Captain, I want to know more about the soldier who coordinated ground operations during the aviation emergency. Outstanding performance, but her competence level suggests experience that doesn't match her apparent rank and position." Williams realized that Rachel's emergency response had created exactly the kind of attention she had been working to avoid. Her performance had been too competent, too professional, and too effective to ignore or rationalize. Multiple senior personnel had now witnessed capabilities that demanded explanation. "Sir, Private Torres is scheduled for a counseling session to address similar questions about her background. Today's performance has certainly added urgency to that discussion." Colonel Martinez nodded. "I want a complete report on her actions today, and I want answers about her background. Someone with her demonstrated capabilities should be utilized appropriately, but we need to understand what we're working with." As the emergency response concluded and normal operations resumed, Rachel attempted to return to her usual invisibility. But the day's events had made invisibility impossible. Too many senior personnel had witnessed her performance, too many questions had been raised about her background, and too many people now understood that Rachel Torres was not the unremarkable soldier she pretended to be. The counseling session that had been postponed due to the emergency would now take place under completely different circumstances. Instead of investigating suspected discrepancies in her background, command personnel would be demanding explanations for demonstrated capabilities that had been witnessed by dozens of personnel across multiple organizations. The emergency at Quantico had created the exact situation Rachel had been hoping to avoid. Undeniable evidence of expertise that couldn't be explained by her supposed training and experience, witnessed by senior personnel who had the authority to demand answers and the resources to investigate discrepancies thoroughly. The moment when Drill Sergeant Hayes would grab her collar was now only days away, but the foundation for that confrontation had been solidified by her decision to use her real capabilities to save lives rather than maintain her cover. The choice she had made during the emergency would soon force choices she could no longer postpone. The rescheduled counseling session took place on Thursday morning in Captain Williams' office, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed from what anyone had originally anticipated. Instead of a routine administrative inquiry about possible discrepancies in Rachel's personnel file, the meeting had evolved into a formal investigation involving multiple levels of command and representatives from organizations whose presence indicated that Rachel's situation had implications far beyond company-level personnel management. Present at the meeting were Captain Williams, First Sergeant Patterson, Colonel Martinez representing Battalion Command, and Major Sarah Chun from the installation's Personnel Security Office. The presence of personnel security immediately elevated the stakes, as such offices only became involved when soldiers' backgrounds presented potential security concerns or when administrative irregularities suggested possible intelligence implications. Rachel entered the office in full dress uniform, her bearing reflecting military discipline that seemed more pronounced than usual. She had clearly prepared for this confrontation, but her preparation appeared to involve steeling herself for revelations rather than formulating denials or evasions. Her posture was straight, her expression was controlled, and her hands were steady, but something in her eyes suggested resignation to an outcome she had long expected but hoped to postpone. Colonel Martinez opened the session by reviewing the documented incidents that had led to the inquiry. The list was comprehensive and damning. Exceptional performance during training exercises that exceeded her supposed experience level, tactical knowledge that belonged to advanced specialties, and emergency response capabilities that suggested extensive operational background. The colonel's tone was professional but firm, making clear that the accumulation of evidence had moved beyond coincidence into patterns that demanded explanation. Private Torres, Colonel Martinez began, "We have documented multiple instances where your demonstrated capabilities significantly exceed what your personnel file indicates you should possess. Most recently, your performance during Tuesday's emergency response operation was observed by senior personnel from multiple organizations, all of whom noted competence levels that suggest specialized training and extensive operational experience. We need you to explain these discrepancies." Rachel maintained eye contact with Colonel Martinez throughout his presentation, but those observing her closely could see subtle changes in her expression that suggested internal struggle. She was weighing options that probably included continued denial, partial disclosure, or complete revelation of whatever truth she had been concealing. "I understand your concerns, sir," Rachel replied, her voice steady but carrying undertones that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully. "I've tried to perform my duties to the best of my abilities, while meeting the standards expected of someone in my position." Major Chun intervened with questions that indicated her investigation had already uncovered information that wasn't available to company-level personnel. "Private Torres, our preliminary background review has identified several gaps in your recent service history that require clarification. There are periods where your location and duties are not clearly documented in standard personnel systems. Can you explain these gaps?" The question landed like a physical blow. Rachel's composure wavered for the first time during the meeting, and everyone present could see her recognizing that her carefully constructed cover story was being dismantled by investigators with access to information sources she hadn't anticipated. "What specific gaps are you referring to, Major?" Major Chun consulted a classified folder that had not been present during the meeting's opening. "There's an 18-month period where your service record shows assignment to Fort Benning for advanced individual training, but training records don't reflect your presence in any courses during that time frame. There are medical entries that reference treatments for conditions that aren't specified. And there are performance evaluations signed by supervisors whose identities are not available through normal personnel channels. Rachel's breathing became more controlled, as if she was managing stress through techniques learned under more serious circumstances. Her hands remained steady, but those watching could see her making calculations that went beyond simple decisions about what to reveal. Additionally, Major Chen continued, there are financial records that show deployment pay and hazardous duty compensation during periods when your official assignment was supposedly stateside training. These discrepancies suggest either administrative errors of unusual magnitude or deliberate concealment of your actual duties and locations. The evidence was overwhelming and specific enough to make continued denial impossible. Rachel had clearly been operating under assumptions about how thoroughly her background could be investigated, and those assumptions were proving incorrect when faced with security personnel who had access to databases and resources beyond normal administrative channels. First Sergeant Patterson recognized that Rachel was approaching a breaking point and intervened with an approach designed to provide her with a framework for honest disclosure. Private Torres, we're not conducting this inquiry to punish you for concealing information. Our goal is to understand your actual background, so we can ensure you're being utilized appropriately and receiving any support you might need. If there are legitimate reasons you've been reluctant to discuss your experience, we need to understand those reasons so we can address them properly. Patterson's tone was supportive rather than confrontational, but it didn't mask the reality that Rachel's options for continued concealment had been eliminated by evidence she couldn't explain or dismiss. Rachel looked around the room at faces that reflected various combinations of curiosity, concern, and professional determination. She had reached the moment she had been dreading since her arrival at Fort Cumberland. The moment when she would be forced to choose between maintaining a deception that was no longer sustainable or revealing truths that would fundamentally change how everyone understood her story. Before I respond to your questions, Rachel said slowly, I need to understand what level of security clearance is represented in this room, and whether this conversation is being recorded or documented in ways that might affect my ability to discuss classified information. The question shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting. Instead of a junior enlisted soldier being questioned about administrative irregularities, Rachel was suddenly speaking like someone who understood security protocols and classification systems. Her question suggested that her concealment involved not just personal privacy but potentially classified operations that required appropriate handling. Major Chen and Colonel Martinez exchanged glances that indicated Rachel's question had confirmed suspicions they had been developing about the nature of her background. This room is appropriately secured for discussions involving classified information up to the secret level, Major Chen replied. All personnel present have clearances sufficient for such discussions. However, if your background involves special access programs or compartmented information, we may need to adjust our approach. Rachel nodded as if she had expected this response. Her demeanor was shifting from defensive to professional, as if she was transitioning from someone trying to avoid questions to someone preparing to provide information that required careful handling. I need to make contact with my previous command structure before I can provide detailed information about my background, Rachel said. There are notification procedures that must be followed when my cover status changes, and there are people who need to be informed before I discuss operational details with personnel outside the program. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Rachel's statement. She hadn't denied the discrepancies or offered explanations that might preserve her cover story. Instead, she had acknowledged that her presence at Fort Cumberland was itself part of some kind of operational cover that involved notification procedures and program oversight. Captain Williams found his voice first. Private Torres, are you saying that your assignment to this unit was part of a classified program? I'm saying that I cannot provide complete answers to your questions without following appropriate security procedures, Rachel replied. I can tell you that my service record contains deliberate inaccuracies designed to support operational requirements that are no longer active. I can tell you that my demonstrated capabilities reflect training and experience that was acquired in contexts that cannot be discussed without proper authorization. And I can tell you that my presence in this unit was intended to be temporary while other arrangements were being finalized. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Colonel Martinez's aide entered with a message that required immediate attention, but the interruption provided everyone with a moment to process the fundamental shift in their understanding of Rachel's situation. She wasn't a soldier with an unusual background who had been concealing her experience for personal reasons. She was apparently someone whose entire presence at Fort Cumberland was part of a larger operational picture that involved classified programs, cover stories, and security considerations that extended far beyond normal personnel management. The counseling session that had begun as an administrative inquiry was evolving into something that might require involvement from organizations and personnel whose very existence wasn't acknowledged in normal military operations. As the aide left and the meeting prepared to resume, everyone in the room understood that the next phase of the conversation would determine not just Rachel's future at Fort Cumberland, but potentially the futures of everyone who had unknowingly become involved in whatever operation she represented. The moment when Drill Sergeant Hayes would grab her collar was still days away, but the foundation for that confrontation was being laid in a conference room where Rachel Torres was finally preparing to reveal truths that would shatter every assumption her fellow soldiers had made about the quiet woman who had been hiding among them. The phone calls that followed Rachel's partial revelation created a cascade of secure communications that reached levels of military and intelligence hierarchy most personnel at Fort Cumberland had never imagined existed. Within 6 hours of the suspended counseling session, encrypted messages were flowing between Fort Cumberland, the Pentagon, Langley, and facilities whose locations were not acknowledged in official directories. Major Chun had initiated the communication chain through channels that bypassed normal military administrative systems, using authorization codes that triggered immediate response from organizations whose existence was compartmentalized even within the intelligence community. The nature of those responses made clear that Rachel Torres represented something far more complex than a soldier with an unusual background attempting to blend into normal military service. By Friday morning, Fort Cumberland had been designated as a restricted access installation pending the arrival of personnel whose credentials were verified through systems that operated independently of standard military identification. The base commander found himself managing an operation whose details he wasn't authorized to know, coordinating with agencies whose names he couldn't acknowledge, and preparing facilities for meetings whose purposes remained classified even from him. Rachel spent Thursday night in quarters that had been converted into a secure holding facility, not as punishment but as protection. She was under guard not because she was considered dangerous, but because personnel with her apparent background required security measures that protected both operational integrity and individual safety. The guards were military police with special security clearances who understood that their mission involved protecting someone whose very existence might be sensitive from operational perspectives. The first external personnel arrived Friday at 0800 hours in vehicles that carried no military markings and were staffed by individuals whose uniforms reflected no unit designations or rank insignia that could be traced through normal identification systems. They established a command post in the base conference facility and immediately restricted access to areas surrounding Rachel's location. Colonel Martinez briefed the arriving personnel about the events that had led to Rachel's exposure, but his briefing was conducted in a compartmented environment where he provided information without receiving explanations about its significance. He described the training incidents, the emergency response performance, and the counseling session revelations, but he was not informed about what those events meant within the larger operational context that Rachel apparently represented. The lead investigator, who identified himself only as Agent Morrison, reviewed the accumulated documentation about Rachel's performance at Fort Cumberland with expressions that suggested both concern and relief. Her demonstrated capabilities were apparently consistent with expectations, but her exposure represented a complication that required immediate management. Has Private Torres made any statements about her intentions or her assessment of the security situation? Morrison asked Colonel Martinez during their private briefing. She indicated that she needed to contact previous command structures before discussing operational details. She seemed to understand that her situation involved classified programs, but she didn't provide specifics about the nature of those programs or her role in them. Morrison made notes in a folder that contained information Colonel Martinez was not authorized to access. Has she demonstrated any behavior that suggests psychological distress or operational security concerns? The question indicated that Rachel's background involved considerations that went beyond normal military service. Personnel with certain types of operational experience sometimes developed stress reactions when their cover stories were compromised, and those reactions could create security risks that required specialized management. "No concerning behaviors that I've observed," Colonel Martinez replied. "She's maintained military discipline and professionalism throughout the inquiry process. If anything, she seemed relieved that the concealment was ending." Morrison nodded as if this response confirmed expectations. "We'll need to conduct our own assessment before determining next steps. The personnel here at Fort Cumberland have performed appropriately, but the situation now requires handling by organizations with specific expertise in cases like this." The phrase "cases like this" suggested that Rachel's situation, while unique to Fort Cumberland personnel, was not unprecedented within certain intelligence and special operations communities. There were apparently established procedures for managing exposures of personnel whose backgrounds involved sensitive operations. Saturday morning brought the arrival of additional personnel, including someone who was introduced to Rachel as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Anderson, a designation that might or might not have reflected her actual rank and identity. Anderson conducted a private interview with Rachel that lasted several hours and covered topics that remained classified even from the personnel who had initiated the investigation. Following the interview, Anderson met with Morrison and other arriving personnel to coordinate what they termed resolution procedures. The nature of those procedures was not shared with Fort Cumberland personnel, but they involved preparations for Rachel's departure from the installation and arrangements for managing the information that company personnel had acquired about her actual capabilities. Sunday evening, Anderson briefed Colonel Martinez about the conclusions that had been reached regarding Rachel's situation and the next steps that would be implemented. Private Torres has been serving in a transition capacity following completion of operations that cannot be discussed in detail, Anderson explained. Her assignment to Fort Cumberland was intended to provide a normal military environment while longer-term arrangements were being finalized. Her exposure was not anticipated, but doesn't represent a security breach that requires disciplinary action. Anderson's explanation provided some context without revealing operational details. Rachel had apparently been assigned to Fort Cumberland as part of a process designed to help her reintegrate into normal military service following involvement in operations that had required her to develop the capabilities that had attracted attention. "What happens to her now?" Colonel Martinez asked. "She'll be reassigned to a position that better utilizes her actual training and experience. The personnel here who became aware of discrepancies in her background will be briefed about information security requirements, but no one has been exposed to classified material that requires special handling." The resolution was designed to address operational security concerns while minimizing disruption to normal Fort Cumberland operations. Rachel would disappear from the installation as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind only questions that couldn't be answered and memories of performance that had revealed capabilities belonging to experiences that officially never happened. But the resolution couldn't be implemented immediately because of events that were already in motion. The quarterly battalion review had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Rachel was assigned to participate in formations that had been planned weeks in advance. Canceling her participation or removing her from scheduled activities would create exactly the kind of attention that operational security was designed to avoid. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson made the decision that Rachel would participate in the battalion review as scheduled, maintaining her cover identity until the ceremony concluded and normal post-ceremony activities provided opportunities for her departure without unusual notice. It was a calculated risk that assumed Rachel could maintain her disciplined performance for one final military ceremony. The decision was made without full consideration of personnel dynamics that had been developing within Bravo Company since Rachel's emergency response performance. Soldiers who had witnessed her capabilities were anticipating the battalion review as an opportunity to see whether she would continue concealing her abilities or finally demonstrate the competence they suspected she possessed. More significantly, the decision was made without considering Drill Sergeant Hayes, who had been conducting his own investigation into Rachel's background and had concluded that the battalion review would provide an appropriate venue for exposing what he believed was deception that undermined military discipline and unit integrity. Hayes had noticed the unusual activity surrounding Rachel during the week following her emergency response performance. He had observed the arrival of personnel who didn't fit normal administrative patterns, the establishment of security measures that exceeded routine requirements, and the general atmosphere of controlled tension that surrounded situations involving sensitive information. But Hayes interpreted these observations through the lens of his own experience and assumptions. To him, the special attention Rachel was receiving suggested that she was either a security risk who had been discovered or a privileged individual who was receiving special treatment that other soldiers didn't receive. Either interpretation violated his understanding of military fairness and accountability. Hayes had scheduled his own confrontation with Rachel during the battalion review, planning to use the formal ceremony as a platform for exposing what he believed was misconduct that had been ignored by company-level leadership. His plan involved challenging Rachel publicly during the review, forcing her to acknowledge her deception or demonstrate the capabilities she had been concealing. The collision between Hayes's intentions and the operational security requirements surrounding Rachel's actual status was inevitable. Hayes was planning to expose someone he believed was deceiving the Army, while security personnel were working to protect someone whose service involved operations that required concealment for legitimate reasons. The battalion review scheduled for Tuesday morning would bring together all the elements that had been building toward confrontation. Rachel's need to maintain cover until her departure could be arranged, Hayes's determination to expose what he perceived as deception, and the presence of 284 witnesses who would observe whatever moment of truth emerged from their collision. The stage was set for the incident that would define how everyone at Fort Cumberland remembered Rachel Torres, not as the quiet soldier who had concealed her capabilities to blend into normal military life, but as someone whose revealed identity would shatter assumptions about strength, service, and the price that some people pay for carrying secrets that protect others' ability to sleep safely. The battalion review began at 0600 hours with the crisp precision that characterized formal military ceremonies. But beneath the surface discipline, currents of tension flowed through the ranks like electricity seeking ground. The formation of 284 soldiers represented the culmination of months of training, evaluation, and preparation. But for those who knew what to watch for, the ceremony carried undercurrents that had nothing to do with military pageantry. Rachel stood in her assigned position within Bravo Company's formation, her bearing reflecting the same disciplined composure she had maintained throughout her time at Fort Cumberland. But soldiers positioned near her could detect subtle differences in her presence. A heightened alertness, a controlled tension that suggested someone preparing for a confrontation she knew was coming but couldn't predict. The reviewing party assembled on the platform erected for senior officers and distinguished guests. Colonel Martinez represented the battalion command, accompanied by representatives from higher headquarters whose presence indicated the ceremony's importance within the installation's training cycle. But among the official party stood individuals whose uniforms bore no unit designations, whose faces were unfamiliar to most Fort Cumberland personnel, and whose attention seemed focused less on the ceremony itself than on specific individuals within the formation. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson maintained her position among the reviewing officials, but her attention remained fixed on Rachel's location within the formation. The operational security plan called for Rachel's extraction immediately following the ceremony, using the natural dispersal of personnel to mask her departure and transition to arrangements that would restore appropriate security around her actual status. But the plan hadn't accounted for Drill Sergeant Hayes, who approached the formation from the side with purposeful strides that suggested he intended to disrupt the carefully orchestrated proceedings. Hayes had timed his intervention to occur during the formal inspection portion of the ceremony, when senior personnel traditionally moved through the ranks to observe individual soldiers and assess unit readiness. Hayes reached Rachel's position just as Colonel Martinez was completing his review of the front rank. The timing was deliberate, designed to ensure maximum visibility for whatever confrontation Hayes intended to initiate. The 284 soldiers standing in formation, the assembled reviewing party, and the various support personnel surrounding the ceremony would all witness whatever moment Hayes was preparing to create. "Private Torres," Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the formation with the authority of someone who had built a career on commanding attention through sheer force of personality. Rachel responded with military precision, but those watching closely could see her recognizing that the moment she had been dreading was finally arriving. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." Hayes stepped directly in front of Rachel, positioning himself where their conversation would be visible to the entire battalion while maintaining the fiction that this was routine inspection activity. His eyes swept over her uniform, her equipment, and her bearing, but his assessment was clearly focused on factors that had nothing to do with regulation compliance. "You think you're special, don't you, Torres?" Hayes asked, his voice pitched to carry beyond their immediate vicinity while maintaining the tone of professional military discourse. The question hung in the air like a challenge that demanded response but offered no safe answers. Rachel maintained her military bearing, staring straight ahead while recognizing that her reply would be heard by hundreds of personnel whose understanding of her situation ranged from complete ignorance to classified knowledge that couldn't be acknowledged in public. "No, drill sergeant." Hayes studied her face, looking for reactions that might confirm his suspicions about her character and motivations. What he saw was discipline that reflected training beyond what basic military service typically provided, composure that suggested experience with situations far more stressful than ceremonial inspections, and control that indicated someone who had learned to manage emotional responses under conditions where loss of control could have permanent consequences. "Then explain to me why you've been lying to every person on this base about who you really are," Hayes demanded, his voice rising just enough to ensure that surrounding personnel could hear every word. The accusation landed like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was being delivered in a forum where Rachel couldn't respond honestly without compromising operational security that extended far beyond her personal situation. She was trapped between the demands of military discipline that required her to answer a direct question from a senior non-commissioned officer and security requirements that prevented her from providing truthful responses. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson moved immediately toward the developing confrontation, recognizing that Hayes was creating exactly the kind of public exposure that operational security protocols were designed to prevent. But her movement would take time, and Hayes was already escalating his challenge in ways that demanded immediate response. "I asked you a question, Private," Hayes continued, stepping closer to Rachel until they were separated by inches rather than the arm's length that military courtesy typically maintained. "Have you been lying about your background, your training, and your experience since the day you arrived at this installation?" The formation held its collective breath as 284 soldiers realized they were witnessing something far beyond routine military discipline. This was personal confrontation being played out on a public stage, with implications they couldn't fully understand but recognized as significant beyond normal ceremonial proceedings. Rachel's response came in a voice that remained steady despite the pressure of the moment. "Drill Sergeant, I have performed my duties to the best of my abilities, while meeting all standards required of someone in my position." It was a carefully crafted answer that acknowledged Hayes' authority while avoiding direct lies that might compromise operational security. But Hayes recognized the evasion and interpreted it as confirmation of his suspicions about Rachel's deceptive character. That was when Hayes grabbed her collar. The action was swift, decisive, and completely unexpected by everyone except Rachel herself, who had been anticipating some form of physical challenge since Hayes began his public confrontation. Hayes' hand closed around her uniform collar, pulling her forward while his other hand moved to her dog tag chain. "Let's see who you really are," Hayes announced, his intention clearly to expose Rachel's identity in front of the assembled battalion. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds but would be remembered by every witness for the remainder of their military careers. Rachel's response was instantaneous and devastating. Her hand moved with speed that belonged to combat reflexes rather than ceremonial discipline, intercepting Hayes' wrist with a grip that stopped his movement while applying pressure that made his intentions impossible to complete. But her technique was so precise, so controlled, that Hayes found himself immobilized without understanding how his physical advantage had been neutralized. More significantly, Rachel's other hand moved to prevent Hayes from accessing her dog tag while simultaneously establishing a defensive position that would allow her to respond to escalation without creating additional security concerns. The movement was professional, efficient, and utterly unlike anything the assembled personnel had ever witnessed from someone supposedly at Rachel's experience level. The confrontation froze in a tableau that revealed everything Hayes had been trying to expose while simultaneously demonstrating why Rachel's background required the protection that operational security provided. Hayes found himself controlled by someone whose capabilities obviously exceeded anything basic military training could provide, while Rachel found herself forced to reveal competence that belonged to operations that couldn't be acknowledged. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson reached their position as the physical confrontation suspended itself in controlled stalemate. Her voice carried absolute authority when she spoke, cutting through the tension with words that ended the confrontation while providing face-saving alternatives for everyone involved. Drill Sergeant Hayes stepped back immediately. Private Torres, release your hold and return to the position of attention. Both soldiers complied instantly, but the damage to Rachel's carefully maintained cover was complete and irreversible. Every person in the formation had witness capabilities that couldn't be explained by her supposed background, demonstrated in response to a situation that had required her to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting herself from unauthorized exposure. Anderson's immediate priority was damage control that would protect operational security while allowing the ceremony to continue without additional disruptions. But she also recognized that Rachel's effectiveness as an undercover asset at Fort Cumberland had been permanently compromised by Hayes's public challenge. The inspection will continue, Anderson announced, her tone making clear that discussion of what had been witnessed was not appropriate during the ceremony. All personnel will maintain proper military bearing and complete the scheduled proceedings. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded according to script, but everyone present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary disguised as routine military discipline. Rachel maintained her position in formation, but her careful invisibility had been replaced by attention that would make future concealment impossible. As the ceremony concluded and personnel began the dispersal that had been planned to cover Rachel's departure, soldiers throughout the formation processed what they had seen with growing understanding that the quiet woman they had known as Private Torres represented something far more complex than any of their previous assumptions had suggested. The incident with Hayes had achieved the opposite of his intentions. Instead of exposing someone he believed was deceiving the army, he had revealed someone whose service involved operations that required deception for legitimate operational reasons. Instead of demonstrating that Rachel was unworthy of the respect she hadn't requested, he had shown that she had earned respect through service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, Rachel Torres disappeared from Fort Cumberland as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind only questions that couldn't be answered and memories of capabilities that officially had never been demonstrated. The soldiers who had witnessed her performance would carry those memories throughout their careers, understanding that they had briefly intersected with someone whose service represented sacrifices they were only beginning to comprehend. The story of the collar grab became legend within military communities where such stories were told, passed down as a reminder that strength often hides behind facades of ordinariness, that assumptions about others' capabilities are frequently wrong, and that some forms of service require invisibility that protects operations more important than individual recognition. For Rachel herself, the exposure marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, as she transitioned from concealment back to acknowledgement of capabilities that had always been present, but had been hidden to protect missions that continued even after individual operations concluded. The moment when Drill Sergeant Hayes grabbed her collar had lasted only seconds, but its implications would resonate for years among the 284 witnesses who learned that day about courage that doesn't announce itself, service that doesn't seek recognition, and strength that reveals itself only when circumstances make concealment impossible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.